I was born into a world that never quite seemed ready for me. In the hushed corridors of my early memories, I can still recall the sound of footsteps echoing down an empty hallway, the quiet murmur of adults whispering words I couldn't yet understand. Even as a child, I sensed that there was something different about my story, a secret sorrow that hovered behind every smile, every gentle pat on the head. My name is Daniel, a name that, over the years, has come to symbolize both resilience and quiet defiance. I remember the faded photographs that lined the walls of our modest home. There was the smiling face of a woman I never truly knew, my mother, a face that appeared in glimpses of memories recounted by my father, David. She had been a vibrant presence in the lives of others, yet for reasons I never fully comprehended. She chose a path that led her away from me. As the years went by, that absence grew into a void, a silent accusation that perhaps I was never meant to be. But as I grew older, I also began to understand that some wounds run deep, and not all of them are visible. I can still remember the early days of my life as if they were scenes in a movie, flickering images that never quite came together. I was born shortly after my father's long period of mourning. The day I was born, the sun shone as if trying to dispel the lingering sadness that clung to our little world. But even then, there was an undercurrent of tension that no one could quite explain. My father, David, had spent the better part of 2 years grieving for his late wife, Helen, a woman whose memory was enshrined in every corner of our home. There were pictures of her smiling from framed snapshots on the mantel, and her gentle presence seemed to echo in every whispered conversation. In many ways, Helen was both a guiding light and a ghost that haunted the halls of our family life. I was never quite sure why I felt so out of place. As a toddler, I watched my father move around with kind of mechanical precision, as if he were following a ritual that demanded his utmost attention. There were moments when he would catch me staring at one of the photos of Helen, and his eyes would flash with something akin to regret. I did understand then that his sorrow was not just for the woman he lost. It was for the family that might have been, the life he wished he could have had. My mother, whose name was Lisa, had made her decision early on. Even before I could speak, it was clear that she had no desire to be part of the life that my father was trying to rebuild. I remember a time when, as a young child, I would ask Dad about her. His eyes would darken for a moment, and he would say, "She's just not part of our story." In my naive heart, I wondered if there was something inherently wrong with me, if perhaps I was the embodiment of that very absence. There were days when I would wait by the window, watching the world go by, hoping that one day I'd see my mother's face in the crowd. But that day never came. Instead, I was left with a series of half-truths and the lingering sense that I was born out of a moment of weakness, a mistake made in the wake of profound loss. As I grew older, the whispers in the background became louder. I learned that my father had met Lisa during a time when he was still recovering from Helen's death. The story was that, in his desperate need to escape the crushing loneliness of his grief, he had sought solace in a fleeting relationship, a decision that would forever alter the dynamics of our family. Lisa, unlike Helen, had little interest in the role of mother. In fact, she remained a distant figure even as I stumbled through the early years of my childhood. I remember the evenings when I would sit quietly on the floor of our living room, listening to Dad's soft, sorrowful reminiscences of Helen, while Lisa's absence was as loud as any voice in the room. That was when I first began to internalize the notion that I was an unwanted byproduct of mistake, a temporary distraction from a grief too immense to bear. By the time I started school, the outlines of my family had taken on a distinct shape. My father, despite his ongoing sorrow, was determined to give me a stable home, yet stability came at a cost. I was not the only child in the house. Dad had 2 children from his previous marriage, children who had known nothing but the warmth of their mother's love until Helen's untimely death had changed everything. My half-siblings, Ethan and Caleb, as I would later come to call them in my own mind, were both very young when I arrived. Ethan, the older of the 2, was about 11, and Caleb, a few years his junior, was 9. They had already suffered the loss of their mother, and in their eyes, my birth was not a cause for celebration. Their grief was compounded by the shock of a new sibling, one whose very existence reminded them of the fragility of family bonds. I remember the first time Ethan spoke to me about it. It was during a quiet afternoon when the three of us were playing in the backyard. I was busy constructing a makeshift fort out of old sheets and wooden planks, my mind preoccupied with the innocent joy of childhood. Then, without warning, Ethan approached me with an expression of disgust that I still see clearly in my mind's eye. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You're just a mistake Dad made after everything went wrong." The word struck me like a blow. I didn't understand then that his anger was less about me and more about the unresolved pain he carried. Still, the impact was devastating. Every time I heard those words repeated, in hushed tones behind closed doors, in the glaring silence of family dinners, I began to internalize the notion that I was not meant to be, that I was the embodiment of a mistake that could never be undone. In our home, routines were set in stone. Mornings were a blur of hurried breakfast and a scramble to get out the door for school. Afternoons were filled with homework and quiet moments that barely allowed for any laughter. Evenings often meant silent dinners, where the clink of cutlery against plates was the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Dad tried his best to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I recall him making an effort to attend every school play, every parent-teacher meeting. On the surface, he was a devoted father. But beneath that dutiful exterior lay a simmering sorrow, a regret for a family that had once been whole. The constant presence of Helen's memory, manifest in the wedding photos and cherished mementos scattered throughout the house, was a daily reminder of the life that might have been. There were times when I'd catch him staring longingly at a photograph, his eyes misty with memories of a lost past. And in those moments, I would wonder if I was to blame for his lingering sadness. The thought was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one that I carried with me silently, letting it shape my self-image and my perception of my own worth. As I grew older, the chasm between me and my half-siblings only widened. They had a language of their own, a series of stares, whispered insults, and passive-aggressive behaviors that reinforced the belief that I was an interloper. Even as a young child, I was taught to accept that I was different, that my presence was a reminder of a mistake that no one in our family could ever forget. I vividly remember a particular afternoon when the tension reached its peak. We were gathered in the cramped living room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken resentment. Caleb, who until then had been mostly silent, suddenly blurted out, "You're not one of us. You never will be." His voice, small yet piercing, echoed in the room and left me feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. In that moment, every insecurity, every doubt, and every painful memory of rejection coalesced into a single, overwhelming sense of isolation. The emotional scars from those early encounters would go on to shape my adolescence. Each cruel remark and each dismissive gesture became a brick in the wall I built around myself, a fortress constructed not of strength, but of sorrow and resignation. I began to see myself not as a child with potential, but as an unwelcome mistake, a shadow in a family where love was rationed and acceptance was scarce. High school was meant to be a time of self-discovery and burgeoning independence. Instead, it became another arena where I battled the labels that had been thrust upon me from an early age. In class, I would catch snippets of conversation, whispers and sidelong glances that confirmed what I had long suspected. I was not seen as a worthy part of any family. Every comment about my origin, every reference to me as Dad's mistake, chipped away at what little confidence I had managed to muster over the years. I tried to hide my pain behind a veneer of indifference, to laugh off the jeers and sneers. But inside, the words stung like the sharpest thorns. They echoed in my mind during quiet moments and disrupted any attempt at normalcy. Even as I excelled academically and found solace in art and music, there was always that underlying current of self-doubt, a persistent whisper telling me I was less than what I could be. My father, David, remained a constant figure in my life, both a source of support and a reminder of the life I had never truly wanted. He was always there, providing for me in tangible ways. I never had to worry about money, food, or shelter. Yet, as I grew into my teenage years, I began to see the cost of that support in a different light. His care was measured, almost clinical, a series of actions devoid of the warmth that should have come from a parent's love. I was safe, but I was also alone. There were nights when I would hear my father, alone in the dark, talking to himself in a language I couldn't understand. Sometimes I'd sneak out of bed to listen, my small heart pounding with curiosity and dread. In those moments, I sensed that his grief was not something he had ever fully overcome. It was a permanent fixture, like the old wedding ring he still wore on his finger, a symbol of a promise that had long since been broken. One evening, when I was about 14, I found him in his study, hunched over a box of photographs. I watched silently as his weathered hands caressed the images, lingering on a particular shot of Helen. I mustered the courage to ask, "Dad, do you ever regret everything?" His eyes, filled with indescribable sadness, met mine for a brief moment. "Regret?" he echoed softly. "I regret that I lost the chance to have a perfect family. I regret that I can never replace the love I lost. But I do what I can. I do what I must." The words, cryptic and heavy, left me with more questions than answers. I began to wonder if perhaps his love for Helen was the reason he could never fully love me. If my very existence was a reminder of a time when it strayed from the path he had promised to walk. At school, the isolation I felt was compounded by the difficulty of forging genuine connections. I was different, not just in the eyes of my family, but in my own mind. I had grown up with the knowledge that I was a mistake, a secret that haunted every step I took. I spent countless hours in the library, poring over books that promised escape through worlds of fantasy and hope. In those pages, I found heroes who overcame adversity, who transformed their pain into power. But the mirror in the quiet study of my life always reflected back the image of a boy who was never meant to belong. Friends came and went, but none stayed long enough to peel back the layers of my carefully constructed defenses. I was always the quiet one, the one who preferred solitude to the risk of being hurt again. And yet, deep down, I longed for connection, for a sense of belonging that was never granted by the family that had raised me. The idea that I was nothing more than a mistake was a heavy burden, one that weighed on me every single day and threatened to crush the hope that I might someday rise above it. The years in high school passed in a blur of routine and quiet despair. Every morning, I would wake up to the cold certainty that no matter what I did, I would always be an outsider, a mistake too deep to ever be forgiven. The taunts and derisive comments of my half-siblings, though less frequent now that we were mostly apart, had left their mark. Their words, delivered in the early days of my life, had shaped my identity in ways that I struggled to reverse. I began to notice that even small gestures from family members carried the weight of judgment. A sidelong glance, a hushed comment, the way conversations would abruptly change when I entered the room. All these signs confirmed what I had come to believe. I was not wanted. At home, the silence during family dinners was punctuated by memories of better times, a time when love was unconditional, when every smile was genuine. Now, each silence was a reminder of how far we had drifted from that ideal. Emotional scars are peculiar. They rarely fade entirely. They linger beneath the surface, in the quiet moments when the world is asleep and only your thoughts remain. I often found myself awake in the middle of the night, the darkness amplifying the loneliness that had become my constant companion. I would replay the harsh words of Ethan and Caleb in my mind until I could no longer tell where memory ended and reality began. In those moments, I questioned everything. Was I truly unlovable? Was I destined to live a life defined by rejection? I wondered if my father's stoic acceptance of his own grief was somehow linked to his inability to love me the way I needed to be loved. The answers were elusive, buried beneath layers of grief, anger, and regret. I began to retreat further into myself, seeking solace in solitude and the pages of books that promised redemption and escape. There was a day, a seemingly ordinary day, that marked the turning point in my life. I was 16, and the tension between me and my half-siblings had reached a fever pitch. During a family gathering at my grandparents' house, emotions flared like a wildfire. It started with a careless remark, a comment made in the heat of the moment that referred to me as the mistake. But in that moment, something inside me snapped. I remember standing in the center of the living room, my heart pounding in my ears as I tried to articulate the years of pain that had built up inside me. I'm not just a mistake. I shouted, my voice trembling with raw emotion. I deserve to be seen as more than that. I'm more than a decision Dad made when he was drowning in grief. The room fell silent. Faces flushed with shock and anger turned toward me, and I saw in their eyes the same disdain that had haunted me all my life. That outburst, however cathartic, was not met with the understanding I had hoped for. Instead, it only deepened the rift between me and the rest of the family. I was labeled as ungrateful, as a troublemaker who couldn't appreciate the sacrifices they had made for me. The word mistake echoed in every corner of that room long after I had stormed out, and the sting of rejection was a bitter reminder of a lifetime of neglect. In the midst of my isolation, when every door seemed closed and every word was a dagger, an unexpected light emerged. 2 years ago, when I was just a junior in high school, I met Sarah. At first, she was simply a bright presence in my daily life, a smile that warmed me on the coldest days and a laugh that cut the pervasive gloom of my existence. Sarah was different. She had a way of making me feel like I was important, like I mattered, and gradually, I came to realize that her family, too, radiated an acceptance that I had never known. Sarah's family welcomed me with open arms. Her parents, kind and genuine, treated me like one of their own. There was no judgment in their eyes, only a deep-seated belief that every person deserved to be valued. Her siblings, too, were curious and compassionate, asking about my life and listening with a genuine interest that I had never experienced before. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of a family that wasn't bound by blood or history, but by the simple, pure act of caring. I began spending more time at their home, attending family dinners, joining in on weekend outings, and simply basking in the normalcy of their interactions. Their support was like a salve to the wounds that had festered over the years. I no longer had to endure the cold indifference or the cruel whispers that haunted every interaction at home. Instead, I had a place where I could breathe, where I could be myself without the burden of a tainted legacy. In Sarah's family, I found a mirror that reflected a version of myself I had long forgotten, a version that was capable, kind, and deserving of love. They constantly reassured me that I was more than just a byproduct of a complicated past. I was an individual with dreams, hopes, and the potential for greatness. Slowly, as I shared my own stories and vulnerabilities with them, I began to rebuild a sense of self-worth that had been eroded by years of neglect and rejection. I remember one particular evening vividly. We were gathered around a large wooden dining table, the air filled with the aroma of a hearty stew and the sound of lively conversation. One of Sarah's aunts, a warm-hearted woman with twinkling eyes, turned to me and said, "Daniel, you have a light in you. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're less than you are." Those simple words resonated with me, sparking a determination to redefine my identity. I realized that I could choose who I wanted to be, regardless of the labels that had been imposed on me. In the quiet moments that followed, I began to draft my own mental narrative, a story where I was not the unwanted mistake of a grieving man's past, but a survivor, a person who had overcome the odds to find a semblance of happiness and belonging. Sarah's family became my safe haven, a place where every hurt word from my past was met with compassion, and every tear was wiped away with understanding. It was in that warmth that I discovered the strength to stand up for myself, to voice the deep-seated need for recognition, as a whole person with the right to be loved unconditionally. As I grew closer to Sarah and her family, a subtle shift began to take root inside me. The once overpowering narrative of being Dad's mistake started to recede, replaced by a burgeoning sense of identity that was defined not by my origins, but by my choices and values. I learned to see my past not as a chain that bound me, but as a series of lessons that had prepared me for a future filled with promise. Yet, even as I embraced this newfound self-worth, the pull of my original family remained, a reminder of the unresolved pain that lurked in every memory of cold silences and bitter words. The duality of my existence was stark. On one side was a family that had rejected me time and again, and on the other, a family that had shown me what love could truly be. The contrast was both heart-wrenching and illuminating, setting the stage for the inevitable collision of past and present. The winter of my 18th birthday was particularly bitter, not just for the cold that seeped through the walls, but for the emotional chill that had settled over my entire life. I had finally reached a point where I could no longer bear the weight of the past. With the support of Sarah's family, I made the difficult decision to leave my father's home and move in with them, so I could finish high school in an environment that nurtured me instead of tearing me down. The timing couldn't have been worse, though. My decision to leave was made close to Christmas, a time when extended family, steeped in tradition, and the painful memory of lost loved ones was more volatile than ever. The whispers started almost immediately. I could feel the weight of their disapproval every time I mentioned spending the holidays with Sarah's family. It was as if my leaving was an act of betrayal, a deliberate rejection of everything my real family had done for me. I remember the day clearly, a biting winter afternoon, when I received a call from my aunt. Her voice, laced with disappointment, told me that I was being ungrateful. "How can you just walk away from your family at Christmas?" she demanded. "After everything, you owe it to us to show some respect." The words, delivered in a tone that mixed anger with sorrow, made my chest tighten with conflicting emotions. I knew they meant well, in their own twisted way, but the sting of rejection was too fresh, too familiar. That same week, as I packed a single suitcase with the few belongings I could call my own, the tension in our household was palpable. I tried to explain to my father that I needed a place where I could breathe, where I wasn't constantly reminded of being an afterthought, but his eyes betrayed a complex mix of regret and resignation. "It's Christmas, son," he said in a low, almost defeated tone. "Your grandparents and the rest of the family, they have expectations. I wish things were different." His words, intended as a plea for understanding, instead felt like a confirmation of everything I had feared, that no matter how much I tried, I would always be a disappointment. A week before Christmas, I agreed to join the extended family at my grandparents' house for a final attempt at reconciliation, a meeting that I had been dreading for months. The house, usually a sanctuary of holiday cheer, felt stifling and cold. I could sense every eye on me as I entered the living room, the air thick with unspoken resentment and fragile hope. The decorations, meticulously arranged and glowing in the dim light, were a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling inside me. As the evening progressed, the tension reached its breaking point. Conversation flowed haltingly, punctuated by awkward silences and furtive glances. Eventually, unable to bear the weight of the accumulated pain any longer, I stood up and asked to speak to everyone. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I cleared my throat, the room falling silent in anticipation. "I'm tired," I began, my voice wavering as I struggled to find the right words. "Tired of feeling like I'm nothing more than a mistake, nothing more than a reminder of what Dad did when he was too broken to love properly. I'm not here just to fill a gap, or to be a substitute for someone I never even knew. I deserve to be seen as more than that. I deserve to be treated like I matter, like I'm a person worthy of love and respect." For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fireplace. Then, as if time itself had frozen, the murmurs began. My father's eyes filled with tears, and I could see the shock and hurt reflected in the faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins. But even as I spoke, I knew that the old wounds ran deep. The room was filled with a mixture of disbelief and indignation, and I braced myself for the backlash that was sure to follow. In the days that followed the Christmas gathering, the tension in our family reached a fever pitch. My outburst in my grandparents' house had left a scar that could not be easily healed. I found myself the target of both overt and subtle reprisals, a barrage of accusations, snide remarks, and even outright hostility. The once familiar faces of my extended family now seemed alien, twisted by grief and unyielding tradition. My father, too, had begun to distance himself from me. It was as if my declaration had forced him to confront the very demons he had long tried to ignore. I could sense his inner turmoil every time our eyes met, an unspoken apology mingled with a profound sadness. "You don't understand," he would say softly whenever I tried to speak with him. "I'm still mourning. I never meant for you to bear this burden." But his words, intended to console, only deepened the chasm between us. I remember one particularly painful confrontation. It was late one evening, and I had returned home from a long, agonizing day of failed attempts to reconcile with my extended family. I found Dad in the study, his face bathed in the gentle glow of a desk lamp as he stared at a photo of Helen. The sight of him, so lost in his own sorrow, brought a surge of conflicting emotions to my chest. I couldn't help but shout, Why can't you see that I'm not just a mistake? Why can't you see that I deserve a chance at happiness?" His silence was more deafening than any words could have been. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "I did what I thought was best at the time. I never wanted to hurt you." But his words fell hollow, swallowed by years of neglect and unspoken regrets. In that moment, I realized that the man I needed to forgive was not just my father, but the entire tapestry of grief and mistake that had woven itself into every aspect of my life. The backlash from my extended family was swift and unyielding. Conversations in hushed tones turned into public condemnations. "You're ungrateful," they said. "You have no idea what sacrifice means." I heard it all. The accusations that I was disloyal, that I was turning my back on my roots and disrespecting the memory of those who had given so much. I was labeled a traitor, a child who had rejected the only family that had ever been there for me, even if that family had been flawed and unable to provide the warmth I so desperately needed. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the insinuation that I was somehow responsible for the grief and the strife. The argument that if my father ever died, I would be forced to live with family that viewed me as an aberration was a constant, painful refrain. I was made to feel as though my very existence was an affront to their memories, a blemish on the family legacy that no amount of hard work or change could ever erase. Amidst the storm of recriminations, there was one voice that remained steady and resolute, Sarah's. She had witnessed the unfolding drama with compassionate, unwavering gaze that reminded me that not all families were defined by blood and history. "You are so much more than what they say," she told me one cold evening as we walked along the snow-covered path, our breaths forming clouds in the icy air. "Your worth isn't determined by their pain or their inability to see beyond their own grief. You are a person, Daniel, with dreams and a heart that deserves to be cherished." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of despair. Yet, even as I leaned on her support, the confrontation with my extended family continued to haunt me. I found myself in heated discussions, debates that spiraled into shouting matches, where every attempt to articulate my feelings was met with derision and a refusal to see beyond the narrow lens of tradition. I recall one particular evening when the arguments escalated into something almost unrecognizable. My uncle, a man who prided himself on a stoic adherence to the past, declared, "You should know better than to take the words of grieving children to heart. This isn't about you. It's about respecting the memory of your aunt and the sacrifices your father made." His words, cold and dismissive, only served to reinforce the painful dichotomy between the family I'd known and the one I was beginning to build on my own terms. In the midst of these battles, I realized that the confrontation was not merely about a disputed Christmas or misguided comment. It was a war for my very soul. It was a struggle to reclaim my identity from the clutches of a past that had been defined by sorrow and regret. Every heated conversation, every tear-filled argument was a step toward the truth, that I was more than the sum of my origins, that I was entitled to happiness, acceptance, and love. In the weeks and months that followed that fateful Christmas, I found myself at a crossroads. The bitterness of confrontation had not only alienated me further from the family that had raised me, but it had also forced me to confront the deep-seated insecurities that had long haunted my every step. I began to understand that the journey towards self-acceptance was not a straight path. It was fraught with setbacks, painful revelations, and moments of unexpected clarity. I spent countless nights writing in a battered journal, pouring out my thoughts in a desperate attempt to untangle the mess of emotions that swirled within me. I wrote about the cold dinners, the whispered insults, and the lonely nights when the only sound was the echo of my own doubts. But I also wrote about the gentle kindness of Sarah's family, about the hope that glimmered in the midst of darkness. In those pages, I found a record of my evolution, a testament to the strength it took to stand up for myself and demand a life defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the promise of the future. The process of healing was neither immediate nor complete. There were days when the pain and rejection would overwhelm me, when the old wounds would reopen with a fresh intensity. But there were also moments of quiet triumph, a smile exchange with Sarah, a supportive conversation with one of her cousins, a simple act of kindness that reminded me I was worthy. Each small victory, each moment of acceptance, chipped away at the armor I had built over years of isolation. I began to realize that my father's grief, while deeply painful for him, was not an excuse for the emotional neglect I had endured. It was a complex tapestry of sorrow and regret, one that had colored his actions in ways he could scarcely control. And while I wished things could have been different, I knew that the journey toward understanding and forgiveness was a long one that required both compassion for myself and empathy for the flawed man who had once been my entire world. In time, I found solace in the idea that I could redefine my own destiny. I enrolled in community college, choosing a path that allowed me to explore my passion for literature and creative writing, a way to give voice to the struggles and triumphs of my past. I discovered that by sharing my story, I could help others who've been silenced by similar pain. The narrative that had once defined me as a mistake slowly transformed into a tale of resilience, a story of a young man who, despite all odds, dared to dream a life filled with love, hope, and acceptance. Every day was a struggle, every step a battle against the ingrained voices of rejection. But with Sarah by my side and her family as my newfound support system, I began to see a future that was bright and full of promise. I learned to accept that while the past was immutable, the future was a blank canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of my choosing. I was no longer a byproduct of someone's grief. I was a person with my own dreams, my own values, and the strength to forge my own path. Now, as I look back on the tumultuous years that defined my life, I see a story of transformation, a journey from darkness to light, from being a mistake to becoming a man who is more than the sum of his past. I have learned that the opinions of those who refuse to grow beyond their grief do not define who I am. I am defined by the choices I make, the love I embrace, and the courage it takes to stand up for myself in the face of relentless rejection. I know that the wounds will always be there, echoes of a childhood marred by neglect and a family that could never fully accept me. But those scars are not marks of failure. They are badges of survival, proof that I have endured and grown stronger despite the odds. I now carry with me the gentle reminders of Sarah's family, their warmth, their acceptance, and the belief that every person is worthy of love. And each day, as I continue on this path of self-discovery, I remind myself that I am more than a mistake, more than a remnant of a grieving past. In time, I have come to understand that forgiveness is not about forgetting, but about choosing to embrace a future that is free from the constraints of old pain. I have forgiven my father, not for his sake, but for my own. I have forgiven my half-siblings and extended family, not to absolve them of their actions, but to free myself from the chains of their judgment. And in doing so, I have finally claimed the identity that was always meant to be mine, a person defined not by tragedy, but by the strength to rise above it. So here I stand today, on the precipice of a future that is bright and full of endless possibility. I have learned that the past, no matter how painful, does not have the final say. I am the author of my own story, and I choose to write a narrative of hope, resilience, and above all, love. I choose to be more than the mistake that once defined me. I choose to be a man of substance, kindness, and unwavering courage. And as I move forward, I carry with me the memory of every hardship, every tear, and every moment of despair, knowing that they have all led me to this point. They have taught me that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of light waiting to guide you home. And now, with that light shining brightly, I am ready to embrace a future where I am seen, heard, and cherished for who I truly am.